Pat, did you and Art get all the dope on our new route van the other day?
We got the principles, Ralph. But Tex said he'd tell us more about servicing the steering and other units today.
Leave it to me, Ralph. I'll make route van specialists out of Pat Hart.
Attaboy, Tech. Go to it. I'll stick around and help you out.
Let's start with the front end, Tech. I got an idea it's going to be a rugged deal adjusting that new steering system.
For gosh sakes, Art. You're bellyaching before you know what it's all about. Now listen. There's no basic change in the steering gear.
Right. On this light job, it's the regular worm and roller type with a ratio of 18.2 to 1. And on the other job, because you have heavier loads, you got a worm and sector type with a ratio of 23.2 to 1. Neither type's going to give you any headache. For instance, you know how to adjust for backlash, don't you?
Sure. For backlash and end play, you just use shims and the adjusting screw.
Right. That's all there is to it.
That stuff's in the shop manuals, isn't it, Tech?
Sure, Pat. But there is something new here. If you ever replace the steering column, you'll notice that the gear end is in a split housing.
That's so you won't strain the steering column when you tighten the brace between the column and the instrument panel.
I see what you mean. The elongated holes in the frame part of the housing let you fasten the housing to the frame and leave the stud nuts loose. Then, when you bolt the brace to the instrument panel, the column lines up with the frame mounting. Then you tighten the stud nuts. Right, Tech?
Right on the nose, Pat.
Sort of no strain, no pain deal, eh?
That's the idea, Art. Now let's get down to the steering linkage on this job. Do you fellas remember what I told you about it?
Let's see. They connect the steering gear arm to the knuckle arm with 2 drag links.
They do it that way so they can keep the front axle back where it belongs and still get the necessary leverage. Now the upper drag link runs from the steering gear arm to the idler arm. The lower drag link runs from the idler arm to the steering knuckle arm.
Correct, Art.
Those drag links are connected to the idler arm by insulated ball studs.
And the lower link is hooked up to the knuckle arm by a ball stud, too.
Sure. But the upper link is fastened to the steering gear arm by a split socket connection. If you ever have to adjust that connection...
I know. You screw the end plug in the socket till it's snug. Then you back off a quarter turn to the nearest cotter pin hole so you can lock the nut in position.
That linkage system is pretty good, Tech, but I'll bet a man has to be mighty careful about adjusting it.
You're not thinking while you're looking, Art.
If you look closely, Art, you'll see that the links can't be adjusted because the ball ends are welded to the tube. But let's suppose a driver said his van wanders instead of staying on a straight course. If you got the job, you'd figure...
I'd figure the roller wasn't on the center point of the worm.
You'd be right, too. And here's what you'd do. First, you remove the steering gear arm from its shaft.
Wait till I get something to pry it off.
You don't pry it off, Art. There's a puller for pulling that arm. Go get it from the tool room. Oh, I know you got muscles, but let's take advantage of the tools we have, too.
That's the idea. And when you get that arm off, Pat can get in the van.
Yeah, I know. I count the number of turns the steering wheel makes in turning from the extreme left to the extreme right. Now I turn her back half that number of turns.
I see. That puts the steering gear shaft in the center of the worm.
Right. Now we set the wheels straight ahead.
I'm beginning to get it. We want the steering gear shaft centered, and at the same time we want the wheels straight ahead. So when we get those 2 positions right, we may have to reposition the steering gear arm on the splines of the roller shaft. That's why we pull the arm off first, huh?
Right, my boy. Now, suppose you hook it up.
Well, all I got to do is attach the arm to its shaft. There. The steering gear shaft is centered, and the wheels are straight ahead. Say, Tech, do you have to check wheel alignment when you're getting a new van ready for delivery?
Gosh, no. Keep your big mitts off those front ends. Caster, camber, kingpin inclination, toe out, all these things are set right at the factory.
Tech's got something there. When a van is new and stiff, you can't get a good reading anyway. There's only one steering adjustment you should make on a new van. You know what it is?
Well, towing is the only thing left. What say we check this job now?
We scribe a line around each tire instead of using a scuff board, right?
Right. What do you do next?
Well, now we measure the distance between the lines, front and rear. Set the gauge as near to the height of the hubcap as you can.
Came out with 1/8 of an inch toe in. How's that check with the specifications for this job?
Just right, Art. But if it hadn't been, you'd have to loosen the tie rod end clamps and turn the tie rod.
Do you adjust toe in on the heavy model the same way?
Nope. On the Model EU, the tie rod turns up at the ends in order to clear the springs. So, on the heavy model, you've got to disconnect the tie rod from the steering knuckle arm first.
Then you turn the tie rod end and tow them in not more than 1/8 of an inch, huh?
That's it. 1/3 of the ball end will change toe in about 1/16 of an inch.
I guess that settles the front end. I gotta admit, I haven't seen anything that'll give us mechanics any new headaches. Now, Tech, how about stopping this van? Is there anything new about the brake system?
No, as long as you're familiar with hydraulic brakes. You won't have any trouble with the brakes on this job. Show them where they fill the master cylinder, Ralph.
Just remove this plate from under the accelerator. That's the master cylinder. It's easy enough to get at.
Sure enough. I suppose you go underneath if you have to remove it.
That's right, Art.
Say, Tech, what is this little switch for?
I was just waiting for you to ask that, Art. It's a switch for the brake lock.
The brake lock? You mean you can lock the hydraulic brakes instead of pulling on the handbrake?
Yeah, and it's a handy gadget. Easy to use and really holds the van, even on a hill.
I was going to say something about that, Tech. I saw the regular stoplight switch at the end of the master cylinder, and then there was another switch like it in the brake line just after the T connection.
That's right, Pat. But there's more to it than just a little diaphragm switch. I'll show you from this reference book just how the brake lock works.
Wait till I get somebody to turn the record over.
You fellas can figure out how this brake lock works. Look, there's a solenoid arrangement with the plunger acting as a check valve. When that plunger is closed, it keeps the brake fluid in the lines from returning to the master cylinder.
Oh, I see how it works. Look here, Art. When you step on the brake pedal and send fluid out to the brakes, the pressure of the fluid closes this switch just like the stoplight switch is closed. Then, when you snap this little toggle switch on, the circuit is completed to the solenoid, which draws the plunger in against its seat. That means the fluid in the brake lines can't get back into the master cylinder when you take your foot off the brake pedal.
Is the solenoid drawing current all the time the brakes are being held on?
No, Art. When you take your foot off the brake pedal, you relieve the fluid pressure against the switch. The switch opens, so the solenoid's no longer energized.
I see. Then, when you snap the toggle switch off, the solenoid plunger is released and is pushed off its seat by that little spring, so the fluid can get back to the master cylinder, huh?
No, it don't work like that, Art. There's so much pressure against the solenoid plunger that the little spring isn't strong enough to push the plunger off its seat.
Well, if cutting the current of the solenoid doesn't release the brake fluid, how do you get that check valve off its seat?
Very simple, my boy. You tell him, Ralph.
Well, the first thing is to cut off the switch. That'll keep the solenoid from being energized. Then, if you make the pressure on each side of the plunger equal, the spring will push the plunger off its seat. In order to do that, kick the brake pedal to build up the pressure on the master cylinder side of the plunger so the spring force it off its seat. Then the spring will hold it off.
You see, Art, if you didn't kick the brake pedal to equalize the pressure on each side of the plunger, you'd never get the brake lock to release.
What if the system got out of order and the valve stuck closed? Then you'd have to take it off to release it, I suppose.
No, Art, because you can always kick up enough pressure with a brake pedal to shoot that plunger off its seat. Even if you had a breakdown in the diaphragm switch or the solenoid, you couldn't get stuck with the brakes locked on, Because with that kind of a failure, the brake lock wouldn't go on in the first place.
I see. And you could always replace the switch or the complete brake lock unit.
The only other thing that might happen is a failure of the van's electrical circuit, and that could be traced out.
Hey, you boys certainly figured that out all right. Now, let's get into the adjustment of the clutch linkage.
Brother, I was afraid you'd bring that up. With that engine setting way off to one side, why, I bet the clutch is controlled by radar.
Art, you'd suspect your mother of putting salt in the sugar bowl. Ralph, you show 'em how simple the clutch linkage really is.
In the first place, don't look for a clutch cuff stop screw. The floorboard stops the clutch pedal. Now, when you push down on the clutch pedal, you rotate the cross shaft. The cross shaft is connected to the clutch release forking shaft by this adjusting yoke arrangement.
Heck, Art, that linkage arrangement's simple enough.
Sure. I knew it would be all the time, but didn't Tech say some vans have fluid drive?
Yeah, some vans are equipped with fluid drive, Art, but there's not much difference in the linkage.
I suppose there'd be some change, though, because the fluid drive housing is longer than the conventional housing.
Sure. So they moved the number 2 frame crossmember back a little.
Which means there's only a slight difference in the relative positions of the cross shaft and the release fork.
Well, then, the operation of the linkage is the same, so the slight change in position doesn't make any difference as far as adjustment is concerned.
The operation's the same. But what about the adjustment for free pedal play?
No difference, Art. All you do is turn the adjusting rod into the adjusting yoke enough to allow 1 inch of free pedal travel before the release bearing contacts the levers. And while we're on this subject, I want to tell you something about the operation of this van when it's equipped with fluid drive.
Go right ahead, boss.
First of all, Tech has told you some of these vans will have fluid drive. Since this is the first time fluid drive has ever been offered on a truck, you fellows will be talking to drivers who've never driven with fluid drive before. I want you to be able to give them the right story on how to use it in making their jobs easier. This unit isn't any different from the unit we've had in passenger cars for the past few years. You want to be sure to tell these drivers they should always start off in a lower gear because they'll be moving a pretty heavy load most of the time. Trying to start off in high will waste time and gas. And another thing, they'll be making a lot of stops in one block, so they can just leave the transmission in the lower gear all the time. Then they won't have to shift every time they want to move a few feet. It's all right to leave the transmission in gear and set the brakes while they're making a delivery to a house, like delivering milk or small packages. Then when they move on, they just flip the switch, kick the brake off, and step on the gas. Since the door-to-door drivers do most of their driving standing up, fluid drive makes this type of operation easy. You see, releasing the brake and stepping on the gas is a one-foot operation. There's no need to sit down and push the clutch pedal with the other foot and then shift gears. The driver simply walks in, flips the switch off, kicks the brake, moves ahead, stops, flips the switch on, and walks out. Now, on the conventional models, the driver has to sit down, release the brake, declutch, shift gears, clutch and accelerate, declutch, and so on for better than 10 operations. In other words, more than twice as many operations as required by fluid drive. So you see, fluid drive will save the driver a lot of time when he's covering his route.
In case you're wondering about whether too much heat will develop in that fluid drive unit and maybe cause damage, let me tell you this. The safety factors built into the unit will let the engine run at idle speed with the transmission in gear and the brakes set for as long as 2 hours without doing any harm.
Of course, if a driver's going to stop that long, like going to lunch, he'd naturally cut off the engine when he parked the van. Well, you fellas got any questions up to this point?
Nah, this job's not so tough for a couple of smart guys like me and Pat.
Yeah, it took a lot of talking, boss, but we finally convinced Art that this route van won't be so tough for anybody to service once you get the hang of how it's made.
You've given us a lot of good dope, Ralph, and Tech says there's more coming.
You bet there is. I gotta give these fellas the lowdown on that rear wheel suspension. We'll have to get them together for another session pretty soon.
That's a good idea, Tech. We're going to sell a lot of these vans. And I want the boys to know all the answers so they can live up to our reputation for dependable Dodge service.
I wish Tech would hurry up and come back, Pat.
What's the matter, Art? You got it in for the little fella?
No, I've been thinking about that drive arrangement on the route van. You know, the engine off to one side, the differential in the center and mounted on the frame, and those universal joints driving the rear wheels. I'd like to get some more dope on that setup. Tech could give me the lowdown if he were around.
Why, you've been giving Tech a bad time whenever he starts talking about the new job.
Yeah, but I've been trying to think where I'd seen an arrangement like that before. You know, it looks an awful lot like some of the Special Army trucks I used to work on.
Well, I guess Tech will be back. At least he said he would.
And when old Tech makes a promise, you can bet he'll keep it. I've just been waiting for you guys to get some free time. Now, what's eating you?
Let's put her up on the hoist, Tech, and I'll show you.
Well, while you're doing that, Pat, see if you can get Ralph over here.
This idea of mounting a differential on the frame, you said it's a new system, but I've seen something like it on one of those Special Army trucks.
Sure you have, Art. This system saw a lot of service. I don't want you to think it ain't been tried and proved before.
You know, this rear-end suspension and drive system is being used commercially for the first time on the route van.
I don't suppose we have to tell you how good it is since you used to work on them.
Well, I'll tell you, Tech. I was a lube jockey, not one of the hammer and chisel boys. I don't mind saying I don't know as much about the rear end as I'd like to.
Okay, Art. Do you guys remember what I told you when we first went over the van?
Let's see. You said the differential is mounted on the frame. Then we got a stub shaft coming out each side. And the stub shafts send the power through universal joints to the shafts that turn the wheels.
That's the picture, Pat. Now, what do you say we get down to brass tacks? Notice how the differential is mounted to its support arms?
I see. There's a couple of studs coming out of the differential housing to hold it to the support arms.
Looks like these screws under the support arms help carry the differential, too.
Right, Art. Those are self-locking cap screws.
The rubber insulators between the support arms and the frame members look like the ones on the rear engine mounts.
Yep. And when you install them, make sure you get the large washers in the right position.
You know, Pat, those insulators help to cushion the shocks from the differential. And they also help to keep normal differential noises out of the body.
With a setup like this, I guess we got a lot to learn about the differential.
Art, you know, sometimes I think you'd be happier working on a kid's coaster wagon. Now listen, inside the differential and carrier assembly is the same as you've always seen on Dodge trucks.
The part that's new is the differential carrier housing and the way the drive shafts are mounted. This stub shaft, which is called the differential drive shaft, is supported by a ball bearing seated in the carrier housing.
That stub shaft splines into the differential gear, doesn't it?
Yep, just like the regular axle shaft, Pat.
Now, on the outer end, there are splines to fit the internal splines of the universal joint yoke. The yoke is held to the shaft by a nut.
I get it. Instead of a shaft running from the differential to each rear wheel, like an ordinary truck, this job uses a short shaft and two universal joints that are connected to each other.
Yeah, and those two joints sort of telescope. One fits inside the other. Then as the wheels move up and down, the joints get shorter or longer, depending on the distance between the wheel and the differential. But, what's this cover?
It's a boot to keep dirt and water out of that sliding joint.
Those dust boots are mighty important. Because if those joints ever lock, the first good bump will make the wheels squeeze the differential like an accordion.
Yeah, and those splines are chrome-plated for protection. Better keep an eye on the dust boots so they stay in good shape.
Is this shaft in the wheel hub keyed to the hub, Tech?
Nope. You got a full floating axle mounting in this job, Pat. You know, that's when the wheel is mounted on the housing. So the housing and not the axle shaft supports the weight of the vehicle.
Now, wait a minute, Tech. How can you have a full floating axle when you haven't got an axle housing?
Instead of the housing, we use a spindle attached to the rear axle. The wheel is mounted on that spindle.
That's right, Tech. The shaft goes through the spindle, Then, a driving flange is splined to the outer end of the shaft and is bolted to the wheel hub.
Yeah, I get it. Let's go back to what the wheels are really mounted on. These spindles. Yeah, I see. The spindles that carry the wheels are attached to this I-beam.
Sure, Art. And the springs are mounted on the I-beam. So the beam is what supports the weight of the truck.
Well, I don't know why you guys need me around here.
I can think of one good reason. All we know now is how this rear end setup works. I bet fixing something that goes out of whack is mighty tough. Of course, you can't remove the axle and the differential from this job as easy as you can from an ordinary truck. Better give us the bad news now.
Why, you squawking wrench bender, you. I ought to let you tear this whole job apart just to replace a drive shaft bearing. But, well, rules is rules, and the boss wouldn't go for it.
You don't have to remove the rear end, Art. You can fix this differential drive shaft unit right on the van. Get your tool dolly over here.
Let's just suppose that something went wrong inside that differential housing. Maybe a bearing is acting up and we got to replace it.
Okay, but give me a chance to show off here. I'll disconnect this universal joint that hooks up to the differential drive shaft.
That C784 spanner wrench holds the yoke while you take the nut off the shaft. Then use a puller to pull the yoke.
Hey, this dust guard is coming out with the yoke. Is that all right?
Sure, the guard's welded to the yoke. Now, Pat, the bearing retainer and the oil seal come next.
What are these shims for, Ralph?
They control shaft end play and act as a grease seal. We'll talk about them later, but right now, let's pull the drive shaft.
I hope you got a special puller to reach in there.
Always expecting the worst, eh, Art? Just grab a hold of it and pull it out.
Oh, I see what you mean. A slip fit, huh? Is it always that way?
Anytime it isn't, seems to me you could just loosen the housing bolts to get the shaft out.
It'll always be a slip fit, boys, as long as the housing is aligned on the differential carrier properly. They use gaskets to line her up, and you should put in new ones if you're working in there. You'll find one gasket between the housing and carrier will usually give the right alignment on these DU models, but it may take as many as 3 gaskets to line up the housing on the EU models.
We went in there to look at the bearing. She looks okay to me.
Let's check these other parts, too. Like this oil seal. We want to make sure it's in good condition.
Attaboy, Art. And if you were working on a job that had been in service a long time, you'd check the oil seal contact surface. It must be smooth so it won't cut up the oil seal.
Before you reassemble the job, let's get somebody to turn the record. The part's checked out okay. Let's see you put it back together, Pat.
All right, the shaft and bearing go in first.
And I'll cut a couple of shims to shove in there for the bearing retainer.
Wait. Art, I'll bet you'd use a beating iron on a wristwatch.
Let me explain what those shims are for, Art. The bearing is pressed on the shaft and seats against a shoulder in the housing. The retainer, which bolts to the housing, holds the bearing snug against the shoulder and prevents shaft end play. But you'll notice that there's a space between the retainer and the housing. That space is taken up by shims, which act as a gasket to prevent a grease leak. They also prevent the retainer from binding the bearing.
How many shims do we use?
You'll have to measure the space, Art. So first, you hold the retainer in place by hand and measure the space with feeler gauges. Take that measurement and add 3 to 5 thousandths to it, so your total shim thickness will be 3 to 5 thousandths greater than the space. You may not hit it exactly because the shims are supplied in thicknesses of 15, 20, and 25 thousandths, but work out a combination that'll come as close as possible.
How come you add that 3 to 5 thousandths?
I see what he means, Art. You were just holding the retainer by hand, so when you tighten the retainer bolts, the shims will squeeze up. They'd bind the bearing and twist the retainer if you didn't allow extra space.
If you use too many shims, you'll get shaft end play. If you don't have enough, you may get a grease leak, besides distorting the retainer.
That looks like the ticket, Art. I'll put them in there and install the retainer.
Okay, and I'll finish up with the universal joint.
There she is, Tech. Your differential drive shaft assembly, taken apart and put together again without pulling any big units off the van.
Now, let's get out to the wheel end of this setup, Tech. What's the scoop on the wheel drive shaft?
It's a lot like the differential drive shaft, Art.
You mean we can work right on the van?
No. Take another look and tell me why you can't.
I get you. That bearing retainer sitting down in the axle flange, we couldn't get in there to a measure for shims, huh?
That's the story. So let's pull the wheel and then take the spindle out of the axle.
Drive that spindle out of the axle by tapping the bearing retainer screws with a brass drift.
There's the works. And what do we do with it?
Let's put her in a vise so we can work on it.
Hey, put a little protection on those vice jaws. That assembly costs dough, you know.
Art, I think you're growing to love this van.
Your next step is to remove the retainer cap screws and pull out the retainer and oil seat.
Next, the drive shaft. And I see the bearing is pressed on the shaft.
Sure. And notice there's another oil seal on the other side of the bearing.
And when you're working on this job, I suppose all these parts have to be cleaned and inspected.
That's right, Art.
That sure is a smart drive system, eh, Art?
You're right, Pat. But to hear Tech talk about it, you think he invented it.
Well, I may not have invented it, Art, but there's nothing you guys can tell me about it.
I'll bet I can.
Like what?
Like putting her back together again. First, the drive shaft and bearing go in.
Go in how? Get down to details, my friend.
Okay, Tech. The shaft goes in easy, so you don't jam up the inner oil seal. Then you take a feeler gauge and measure the
distance between the retainer and the spindle face.
Sure. And you make up a shim pack that's 3 to 5 thousandths thicker than the space you measured. Now, I'll install the shims.
And then the bearing retainer and the oil seal assembly.
You want that shaft to run on its own sweat? Pack the bearing with short fiber bearing grease. And also put some grease on the shaft between the bearing and the small outer oil seal.
That's it. Tighten the retainer cap screws evenly. You're ready to put the unit back on the axle.
You install it, Art, and I'll connect the universal joint.
How about adjusting the wheel bearings? Anything new on that?
No, just like on any other job. Turn the nut up until the bearings are tight. Then, you back the nut off about 1/6 of a turn until the wheel rolls free. Install the lock washer and the lock nut, and that's all.
Tech, we'd have to pull the differential if we wanted to work on the gears inside. How much of that ironwork do we wrestle with?
I never knew a man with as sharp an eye for work as you have, Art. But you can relax. Because like everything else on this van, pulling the differential is a lot simpler than it looks. Bring her down and take her over to your stall. Now, jack up the rear end a few inches. Then, well, you can probably tell us what goes on from here, can't you, Pat?
Well, of course, we'll unhitch the prop shaft and stub shaft universal joints. Then we'll unbolt the 4 mounts that fasten the differential supports to the frame cross members.
Wait, with the van jacked up, the differential might slip off. Why not just loosen the mounts, then slip a roller jack under the differential to take the weight? Then unbolt the mounts.
Good idea, Art. With the mounts off, we'll roll the differential back till the support arms clear that front cross member, and tip it down and roll it forward. How's that look, Tech?
It looks like you've been talking to the men who built this van, boys. Now, put it back in, and you'll know as much about the route van as I do. Now, what do you think of this new route van now, Art?
I gotta take back a lot of things I said, Tech. There's a lot of new design features on this truck, all right. But it isn't going to be near as hard to work on it as I thought when I first saw it.
I agree with you, Art. And everything about this van that's different from the trucks you've been working on is in the reference books.
Sure, there won't be any service problems on this job. The customers that buy these vans will be plenty happy with them. And me and Pat will see that they stay happy.